Gonna hit that button and gonna say, hey, everybody, this is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We're so thrilled to have you with us for this ongoing virtual author event series, which we have been doing since April 2020. And I think we are just about at our 200th virtual event that we've done in that time. And we've had such an amazing run of guests over these past months. And it's been a great way to stay connected to you, our audience, and have a tether to you in this weird and wacky time. But I do hope that we will have the opportunity to get some real things back on the schedule as numbers drop and things get better. So just stay with us on that. And you can see our website, magiccitybooks.com. We are one of the only nonprofit bookstores in the country. And so when you buy a book from Magic City Books, you're supporting events that we do throughout the year. So thank you for joining us this evening. Really honored and pleased to have this event tonight that we're going to be talking about. You know, we always try to present a menu of programming that kind of touches on everything from something where you might want to escape into the world of fiction, but also things where we're looking at the issues that we face today. I'm always even more thrilled when I get to be one of you in the audience and watch two people have a wonderful conversation. So before I kind of dive into our special guest for this evening, I want to mention we have a very wonderful guest moderator for this evening, which is Professor Michael Eric Dyson, someone who I've long respected and honestly looked to as someone to help me kind of understand this country that we live in. So it's a very big honor for us to have Professor Dyson with us as a moderator tonight. And I will say, he has a new book dropping in just a couple of weeks, Entertaining Race, Performing Blackness in America. I believe it comes out on November 2nd. We're going to make it real easy for you tonight. We're going to put a little pre-order link here in the chat so you can go ahead and make that make plans to read that when it comes out. So very excited about that. Tonight, we are going to be looking at The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth by Professor Kristin Henning, a book that is quite a read, quite a gut punch in many ways, but something that you will not soon forget. And if you don't know Professor Henning's work, Professor Henning is the Blume Professor of Law and Director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at the Georgetown University Law Center, and has dedicated many, many years of her life to looking at juvenile justice and issues in this area. And if you have questions, and I'm sure many things will come up tonight that will pique your interest and you want to go a little bit deeper, please put those into the Q&A and we will try to get through some of those as we go along. And most importantly, you need a copy of this book, The Rage of Innocence, and we're going to make it very, very easy for you. I'm going to go back to my old joke because it's the only one I've got, which is when we have two authors like this, we're doing a special tonight, 2 for the price of 2. It's just one night only. It's just the old chestnut I keep going back to. So there's that. Thank you all for joining us, and a big, huge thank you to Michael Eric Dyson and Kristin Henning. It's a true honor to have you. So I'll turn it over to you, Professor Dyson, to kick things off. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Great to be here at Magic City. I always wanted to go to Magic City bookstore, and to have this opportunity to chat with such a distinguished legal mind and a woman of huge conscience, not only prominence, but commitment and loyalty to our young people. So what an honor it is to be here tonight with Professor Henning. And it's great to have this opportunity to chat with her. Chris, you've written an amazing book. Let me just say that. It is, as Brother Jeff was saying, a gut punch.
Oh, you were waiting for me to get
It's a gut punch, awakening that is quite dramatic. And, you know, I want to start from the very beginning. I mean, maybe it's narcissism because my middle name is Eric. So you start your book with a young man named Eric. And I got to tell you, you know, we got to tease the audience. Yeah. You got to tell them that story, though. It's the first story in the introduction to your book. And the book is powerful. It has all these stories, you know, your representation of young people. We're going to get to that and how young Black people are criminalized. Right. And we're going to talk about that. But it is in a nutshell, the story of Eric, which embodies and symbolizes the very stigma associated with young people. And on the one hand, you know, white kid does something that's seen as not harmful. In fact, they're helped out. The Black kid goes through months and months and maybe years in terms of its existential impact on him. Tell us the story of Eric and why the story of Eric encapsulates the ways in which the criminal justice system criminalizes Black youth in America.
Excellent. Thank you so much first for just doing this with me, Michael, having this conversation. And I love your, your frame. It's a gut punch, right? But it's truth telling, just like you do in your book. So, thank you. It's wonderful to be in conversation with you. And you're absolutely right. The book starts with a client of mine that I call Eric for purposes of the book. Maybe I was channeling you, Michael, right? But, this is, Eric was a 13-year-old boy who was watching a movie on a Saturday night. In the movie, he sees someone make a Molotov cocktail. 13-year-old mind says, hey, that looks cool. Let me make something that looks like that. He goes into the kitchen, he grabs a glass bottle, and he begins to pour liquids, whatever liquids he can find, right? Bleach, pine sol, you hear me, right? Not things that are gonna be flammable. And then my favorite part is he gets a piece of toilet paper and he runs the toilet paper from inside the bottle to the outside and closes the cap. Well, we know that there's no way that this toilet paper is going to work as a wick. It's going to burn out before it even gets to the top. So his mom has a white carpet. He puts it in his book bag so that it doesn't spill out. He completely forgets about it on a Saturday night. Monday morning, he gets up, his mother drives him to school. He puts his book bag through the metal detector. And a school resource officer says, hey, what is this? Eric immediately says, oh, that's nothing. You can throw it away. And he goes on to class. Little did he know that was the beginning of a 9-month ordeal in DC Superior Court. Police officers showed up at that school. The fire department showed up at that school. They arrested him in front of his classmates, dragged him out. And we represented this young man, litigated everything from, we call arson experts to demonstrate that it wasn't going to be flammable as if we needed to prove that, just on and on. Such a tragic scenario. But here's another real kicker. So in my professor role, some months later, after I start representing Eric, I'm at a conference in New Haven, Connecticut, and I shared this story about Eric at that conference. And a white woman comes up to me after the conference and says, my son did the exact same thing. And I asked her, so what happened to him? And she said, they put my son in accelerated advanced science classes. I mean, is that
rearrange the schedule to do so?
Rearrange the schedule to do so. Isn't it amazing? Such an amazing contrast. And I think you're right, Michael, that story for me was not only a defining moment or a reorienting moment in my own career, but it just encapsulates everything that I talk about in the book. Right? From the ways that we traumatized that my young client, Eric, the way he was criminalized for just normal, creative adolescent behavior that we actually should be praising, that we should be facilitating, promoting, supporting, the ways in which children can't be safe in their own schools, and not safe because they're afraid of like some mass shooter, but not safe because they're at risk of getting criminalized or arrested in their own school.
Right.
So.
No, it's a remarkable story. It's a depressing story because it didn't end just with, okay, after the 9 months, he got called names in school, TikTok, boom, whatever, and, and harassed, so to speak. And then the kind of personal toll on him being identified as some kind of potential criminal and a person who would blow up a school and so on. Because as you say in your book, I just chalked it up first to the fact, all right, schools are over sensitive or hypersensitive, school shootings, but no, you got the white kid, like, let me accommodate you by seeing that you got skills in chemistry. Let me redirect those curiosities and that intelligence into a proper field that would allow you to exploit your natural curiosity, whereas
Absolutely.
the Black kid gets read like a darn, person who's about to blow up a school. And we know disproportionate numbers of people who do the school stuff are young white or at least non-Black kids to begin with. So yeah, it was an incredible story, and it set the tone for the remarkably dispiriting and depressing issues you confront, but you do so with high intelligence and a commitment to trying to prove the case, so to speak. Right. So let's go back a bit. So how is it that, there are two childhoods, at least in America?
Yes.
A childhood for white people and those who are not white. And we can disaggregate it further in terms of sexual orientation or in terms of gender, but the large fault line of race. Talk to us about the construction of childhood, the attachment of the notion of innocence, and how that is either compromised or confirmed and reinforced with, with race as that axis.
Absolutely. I'm going to tell you that I learned so much in writing this book. And one of the things that I learned was about the evolution of adolescence as a distinct stage of development. Really, before the Industrial Revolution, we operated in two stages of development, childhood and adulthood. But then after industrialization, it became clear to white middle-class parents that their children needed new skill sets in order to succeed in America. And so they wanted their children to come out of the field, right, and go to college and stay in school longer to develop those skills. Hence, adolescence was birthed. And what's so fascinating is, at my age, I take adolescence for granted, but it's a relatively new phenomena in American history. Right. And it wasn't until the 1950s that you even see the first use of the word adolescence. And then the word begins to become more common over time. This is a really powerful point because remember, I said it was created, it's a social construct of privilege for white Americans, this extended period of experimentation, fun, creativity you talked about, and education. It's important because Black children are denied that. And they're denied that through the criminalization of normal adolescent behaviors, among other things, right? So while white children are given the privilege of the presumption of innocence that you talked about, right? The opportunity for adventure, experimentation, extended periods of social and educational freedom, Black children are suspended, arrested, stopped, frisked, tried in adult court, more likely to experience use of force at the hands of the police. And again, all for normal adolescent behaviors. And so if we think for a second, remember our childhood, right? What were the most important features and activities of our teenage years? It was the clothes we wore, right? The way we styled our hair, the music we listened to, the friends that we played with, texting today, it's texting on our cell phones. Every single one of those things that I just listed are now the source of a criminal prosecution for Black children, right? So think about, just take music. We could just take any one of those, right? Take music. White children listen to heavy metal, country, rock with the same level of misogynistic, violent lyrics, and with no consequence whatsoever. Black children listen to rap music and they're labeled as the most dangerous children alive. It's things like that, playing with the cell phone, right? Children play with their cell phones all the time when they're supposed to be paying attention in class. And what happens? Y'all remember the story of Shakira in South Carolina, who was ripped from her seat in math class by a school resource officer, right? So there's just stories after stories. So I try to spend time not just talking about the data, which is there, not just talking about the science and the history, but also trying to bring that to life through examples from my own cases, right? The young people that I've represented, as well as some of these high profile cases that we have seen.
Yeah, you do an excellent job of weaving those together and making certain that we understand the philosophical architecture that rests upon the narrative that you present. You know, the study that was done that suggested that young Black kids are perceived as older
Yes.
than white kids or non-Black kids. So you roll up on Tamir Rice.
Yep.
Within 2 seconds, you shoot him. Now, mind you, you're in an open carry state. So why shouldn't you be able to, you know, have a gun? The police ask you, hey, why do you have the gun? Or what are you doing with it? They shouldn't even ask that if the entire state is permitted to do so. But as you point out, so often in your book, there's one set of standards for Black kids and kids of color, and there's another standard for white kids. So when we look at that differential, what does that say about us as a nation, that even the ophthalmological perception of youth, even the philosophical perception of their age is not a mere matter of chronology and scientific data. It's about an existential dread associated with Blackness that computes as an anti-Blackness that then transfers onto the body of our kids. Speak to us about, you know, that real way in which, you know, here we are now, we claim, hey, science, you know, we follow science for COVID and so on, and that's true. But the reason Black people have been skeptical of science is because science has been deployed often to reinforce bigotry and a kind of moray and folkway that would tend to stigmatize Black people. I don't want to do too much. So help us understand that tension with the data-driven conceptions of Blackness that are ill-informed about who we are, that transfer onto the body of our kids.
So I'm going to pull one word that you threw out there: dread. We approach Black children with dread, with fear and dread. And so where does that come from? It's about the deeply embedded stereotypes, assumptions, and fears that we have about Black children. So the question becomes, where do those originate? And I think there is a through line in history from the era of slavery to today, right? It starts with a great deal of intentionality and is now transformed into the American psyche. So let me walk it through, right? So you've got, in the era of slavery, Black children treated as the property of the purported master. And then we move to, skip to the civil rights era, and you can have an Emmett Till who is lynched, right? And so in order to justify the lynching of a 14-year-old boy, you have to intentionally paint him as a threat to white America, and particularly a threat to white women. And so that is, you begin to see that narrative born, really buried into society as a justification. Then we move into the 80s and the 90s, and we see this temporary uptick in crime with the rise of crack cocaine. And then we again have politicians very intentionally manipulating crime as a way of controlling and limiting Black America. We've got the super predator myth about Black children, right? The idea that Black children were going to run amok and rape and kill everyone. That was the narrative, very intentionally constructed, notwithstanding evidence that it was a pseudo-scientific narrative by John DeLulio from Princeton University, later disproven to be absolutely ridiculous, and the super predators never emerged. But again, we've got this narrative that is so deeply embedded in society. So by the time you get to a Tamir Rice, right, that 12-year-old face is barely recognizable as a child because we're so afraid of Black children based on that intentional historical record, right? And so now I say to people all the time, Black, white, blue, green, that the narrative about Black children is so deep that all of us have it at times. You walk through a park, and you're afraid of a group of Black kids irrationally, completely irrationally. And you talked about the research, and now there's empirical research demonstrating the ways in which our biases misconstrue Black adolescents. You talked about the study about Black kids being perceived as older. That's the work of the fabulous Dr. Philip Atiba Goff and his colleagues, finding that both police officers and civilians are likely to misperceive the age of Black children as 4.5 3 years older than they actually are. And I could go on and on. There's tons of research now documenting, evidence that Black children or Black folks in a group look more dangerous, that Black children look older, not just older, but older, more muscular, heavier than they actually are. So.
Right. No, it's a tremendous point. And, we're toggling or pivoting between innocence and demonization, innocence and rage, as you talk about this rage of innocence. And I want you to speak about that because you talk quite openly in the book about the enraging factors that drive you, a highly cerebral, intellectually sophisticated professor of law who deals ostensibly with the facts, just the facts, ma'am, and the myth of neutrality and objectivity that you've mastered in a masterly fashion, deconstructed throughout the book. Because if it was objective and it was fair, if it was objective and it was, something that was fact-based and data-driven, then we wouldn't be doing all this stuff to Black kids. But at every turn, you talk about how prejudice and bias and unconscious and conscious bias and white supremacist logics have clouded the perception of these young people. So speak to us about what's really being amplified in the demonization or criminalization, as you put it, of our youth. What does it draw from? What sets of tropes, metaphors, analogies, beliefs that are condensed and distilled into stereotype? Tell us how those fuel and feed the criminalization of our youth.
Absolutely. It definitely feeds off this biased narrative that we've been talking about, this fear that we've been talking about. And I'm going to, pick up from where you started with rage and my own rage. And I'll say to you that I have been representing children in the District of Columbia for 25 going on 26 years. And in that entire time, I have only represented 4 white children. That's an absurd statistic, And
not because you didn't want to represent them, because they weren't presented as potential, clients or whatever.
Right. It's an absurd proposition. It would lead you to believe either that Washington, D.C. has no white children or that white children don't commit crime. And neither of those would be true. What it is you talked earlier about these notions of innocence, this Western, our commitment as a society, Western commitment to notions of innocence. We deprive Black children of that. We don't see them as innocent. And so our Black children are completely dehumanized as they progress, as they are seen both as older. Philip Atiba Goff's research also talks about the ways in which the mind perceives these young children almost, it's tradition, the monkey, right? And that even in childhood, they are deprived the basics of humanity. And indeed, it's just absolutely enraging. You talk about some of the tropes. We haven't talked much about girls. I make it a point to weave girls throughout the entire book, right? Yeah. And so instead of just setting aside a chapter to talk about girls, I wanted every chapter about everything to include girls. That said, there is indeed a place for a special telling about the criminalization of Black girls. And one of them, indeed, the Jezebel myth starts with the little girl, right? The hypersexualization, the objectification of Black girls in schools. There's been research out of Georgetown's Center for Poverty and Inequality, and they have found, similar to Dr. Atiba Goff's research, that Black girls are perceived to be older, more mature, more knowledgeable. And so when I talk about the criminalization of Black adolescents, I talk specifically about dress codes. Girls, Black girls in particular, are targeted for dress code violations, sent home, ostracized. Instead of being supported, they're disciplined and the like. So all of definitely the brute, thug, Jezebel, all of the tropes are played out in the stereotypes that we have about Black children.
Right. So what do we do about that? I mean, your book, you talk at the end about the resilience and about the comeback, so to speak, and the ways in which, historic patterns of ancestral resistance are channeled, you know, through contemporary examples and role models of that. But how do we combat that? Because if it's deeply entrenched and widely pervasive, then you're doing yeoman's work and relentless interrogation of these social practices that redound negatively in courts, in the places and spaces where you go, where ain't nobody having a sophisticated, nuanced conversation about the stigma and the demonization of Black youth. They're just lock them up, you know, and as you quote, you refer to, you know, Professor Foreman's book about locking up our own. Right. And you talk about how the fact that, you know, we got a Black mayor, we got Black people bails, we got Black people all through the system. Right. So, you know, how do we address that? You know, what do we do about it, number one? And how do we address the fact that a lot of these people who are involved in the system that end up hurting our kids are Black themselves? Yeah, it's a very painful point. And I think you're right. It's yeoman's work. It is what really has to happen to get really where we need to get. And I'll talk about some other strategies that tinker around the edges, but the real hard work is that cultural shift. Right? It is getting folks to see Black children and treat Black children as children. That's the hard work. And one of the things that I really, you know, try to do, and I hope that this book does at some level, is allow people to see themselves in the stories. That looks like me when I was a teenager, or that certainly sounds like my kid, so that the white woman who had that moment with me in Connecticut, other people have that experience. Oh, my child did that. I didn't realize how differently a Black child would experience that moment. So I hope some of the cultural shift comes there. You know, I really think, I think about Brian Stevenson's comment about being proximate, right? Proximate to the community. And so that it's absolutely essential for, if we, all of us, are going to break our stereotypes and fears and assumptions about Black children, we've got to get proximate. We've got to spend time with young Black folks and really get to see them for their laughter, for their joy, for their creativity, you know, for their intelligence, for all the things that, you know, Michael, you and I certainly know about Black children. So we've got to create, you know, we got to create those opportunities. Right. And you know, I say, as a part of that, one of the things, you know, one of my psychologist friends said to me is that every single child, you talked about resilience, every single child has to have one irrationally caring adult. Right. And so what is that about? That means we know that teenagers are teenagers and they make mistakes, but that we stand by them. We see them as resilient. We give them another chance, right? You know, they're not demonized. And so I think part of that work is being that irrationally caring adult for some child. Right? No matter where you sit in society. And that's another way for all of us to get proximate to young Black folks. And we've got to do the internal work. People always ask me, you know, look, you got to do your work. You got to educate yourself, learn, you know, understand your own biases, own your own biases. So when police officers tell me I'm just doing my job, you're not owning your own biases. You're not recognizing why it is that you're perceiving this innocuous behavior, right, by an adolescent as dangerous or threatening, when you wouldn't see that same behavior by a white kid. And I think about all the stories of use of force right now in the news involving Black children. You know, there was an Associated Press, for those of you who haven't read it, Associated Press article that just came out yesterday about use of force against young people, majority of whom are Black, or more than half are Black. And the Associated Press story starts talking about a young kid from South Side of Chicago, 8 years old, named Royal Smart. And the police officers went into his home to execute a search warrant for weapons, which, mind you, were never found, right? And in the process of that, they take the 8-year-old outside and have his hands up, ultimately handcuff him, have him sit outside for 30 minutes. And I gotta tell you, if that was a white child with pigtails, there is no way
There is no way. They would have been creative enough. You don't need a regulation. You don't need any statute to tell you not to do that to a kid, to an 8-year-old kid. And I have to believe that if it'd been a little girl with pigtails, white girl with pigtails in a middle-class neighborhood, it just wouldn't have happened that way.
No, you're absolutely right. A very powerful story that illustrates the lethal persistence of these, stereotypes, these beliefs, these unconscious or conscious biases. But let me dig a little deeper then, because the Austin study that suggested that the transmission of racial material, racial ideals from a racist parent to a child, by the time they're 5, they are concretized in the subconscious, the unconscious, and then eventually into the collective consciousness of an entire group of people. So you figure kids are having transmitted like a virus, these negative beliefs about Black people. How do we do this, make the shift you're talking about? How do we have that intimate acquaintance that allows us to unseat some of the hostilities that are generated as a result of nurturing toxic racial beliefs, which are racist to the core, which are transmitted then to young people in a perpetual cycle of reproduction, so that it's like Deus Ex Machina, it's like the ghost of the machine. Like you ain't gotta have nobody there. It's taking over on its own momentum. What do we do? I don't want to make you to answer the problems that we haven't been able to address, but you're so bright and sharp. What do we do specifically about how white adults and others nurture these beliefs? And they are police people, they are bailiffs, they are judges, they're lawyers and the like. What do we do?
Yeah, it's a hard question. You're gonna give me the whole kit and caboodle, right, to solve it all. But no, I mean, I'm gonna say this to you. I do think there is a bucket of folks that we're not gonna reach, right? They're gonna be some of those bailiffs and officers. And it's not just bailiffs and officers, it's your neighbor, right? It's just the teacher, it's everybody. There's gonna be a bucket of people that a book like mine and the work that you do are just not gonna reach. That said, I can't do this work for an extended period of time without hope and transformation. And so where I grab my hope, even for young white children who have been raised by parents with these racist ideals, is that this moment in history, we've had multiple inflection points in American history, but this moment, this post-George Floyd era, right, which grabbed international attention and sent people out to the streets in droves, is an opportunity for people to at least ask the question, right? And so I think young people, have an opportunity to be in conversation, right? To be outraged by an event that causes them to dig deeper and make their own independent decisions, right? Their own independent analysis. And I think being out there, going out myself, down to the Black Lives Matter Plaza and during the protest and seeing Black folks and white folks together, led me, gives me some hope that we're going to reach some folks. And I'll say this too, that part of, Michael, what I talk about in this book, and when I think about who the audience is, there are so many people who don't know. Right? You don't know what you don't know. So at least there's some segment of white America who, doesn't think of themselves as racist, but are completely responsible for calling 911 when a Black child, knocks on their front door, right? Or getting a shotgun and shooting somebody in Michigan, or right outside Michigan, shooting a child who knocks on the door after a car accident, things of that nature. That group of folks, maybe we get some of those, right? And so there are going to be some folks we're not gonna reach because of that transmission.
Sure. Then you spoke a bit earlier before we get to resilience. Man, time is flying here. What's the gendered character of the perception of rage and innocence and the criminalization of Black youth? You mentioned earlier about how young Black girls are perceived as themselves older, fast-tailed girls and the like.
Right.
Is there, a way in which, white girls who are allowed a certain kind of sexual autonomy and an ethical evolution that embraces a variety of non-traditional or, if we will, irreverent conceptions of female identity? They are celebrated. They are acknowledged as pioneers. They are seen as thumbing their noses in the face of poisonous and patriarchy and toxic masculinity, whereas Black kids who shatter the paradigm or force it into a different direction, or shatter narrow conceptions of propriety and respectability politics, are seen as somehow immoral and unethical. How do we grapple with that?
Yeah, and I really want to situate this conversation in adolescence, right? And so when you ask that question, we're talking about adolescent sexuality, which is even more, demonized. How dare you? You're fast, you're early, all of that when you're thinking about girls. And one of the things that I really try to do throughout the book is situate how normal all of the things that you're talking about, so that sexual experimentation is one of the most normal things in adolescence, right? Yeah. And then, by 18 years old, whatever, I don't even remember the number right now. It's in the book, let's say 60-something% or higher, of 18-year-olds, by the time you reach the age of 18, had some sexual encounter, some sexual intercourse. And then it's even greater when you're talking about other sexual experimentation. And so not only is it normal, but it's healthy, right? It is a marker that this young person is going to evolve in a way that will allow them to have healthy social encounters with other people, right? Loving, caring, compassionate, and then intimacy, which is a really important aspect of development. But then you ask the question, the distinctions, right? The ways in which white girls have always been allowed to, even in secrecy. So, maybe at times, the gentility, requires one to keep it secret, but the expectation is that young girls too, do get to experiment. And they experiment across race, right? So that a white girl can experiment with, a Black boy. But a Black boy, Black football player, can't. Marcus Dixon. We think back, comparing that, to Brock Turner, right? Just compare that. And so in the book, I try to draw those parallels. Think about how confusing it must be, whether it's right or wrong, but confusing it must be for a Black teenage boy to grow up hearing, and particularly an athlete, hearing that boys will be boys. And boys get to do these things. And then the second that a Black boy experiments or buys into or engages, cross-racially, or even within, the same race, they are criminalized, demonized, it's rape, right? And so it's a painful, and I'll tell you, when writing that chapter, and I have there were many chapters in this book. You talk about it's gut-wrenching. It's gut-wrenching to me as a writer, and I had to stop and put things down. But the section of the book where I talk about the differential treatment of sexuality for Black girls and for Black boys versus their white peers, I had nightmares. Just the fear of waking up, or any of my family members waking up and being falsely accused of rape. Because of the stereotypes and the myths and the tropes that you talk about Blackness and sexuality. And I got to say, of all of the categories of adolescence that are most criminalized and demonized, sexuality from the beginning, right, with Emmett Till, right, that's always been the most dangerous or frightening feature of adolescence. And so I'll say this, that I say often, and I say this in the book, it's no coincidence, right, that Emmett Till was just 14 years old when he was lynched. It's no coincidence that Tamir Rice is 12, and all of these kids are being criminalized, shot down, killed in their adolescence. Why is that so important? It's an opportunity to signal to the rest of Black America what the limits are to adolescent development.
Yeah, and that's tragic. It's sad. It's dispiriting, and yet oh so real.
Yes.
So before we get to some of the questions from the audience, what do parents do then? What do Black parents do? Like, you know, you're taking in the wonderful, and we've only scratched the surface of what you've done in your book, the stories you're telling, the criminalization patterns, the way in which the prison industrial complex is fueled and fed Black and brown bodies, which become captives of the state. But what do you do as a parent? Your child has been taken in by the police, pulled in by the police. You know, we talk about the talk and informing our kids, but it's nothing, it's like practice. It's nothing like actually doing it in real game time and situation. What do we tell young Black kids about the police, how to behave vis-a-vis the police, when we see that despite the attempts of Black young people, adolescents, older people even, to adhere to the law and to do everything they're supposed to do, they are still hurt and harmed by police. So help us understand, you know, what kinds of practical things we might be able to do to stem the tide and to reduce the onslaught.
Absolutely. So, you know, I'm going to tell you that question was is so incredibly important. I have an entire chapter called The Politics of Black Adolescent Identity, right? And it really tries to dig deep on this question about the fine line that a Black parent must walk in raising a child. So on the one hand, right, we have to prepare Black children for these moments, these encounters with the police, and not just encounters with the police, but encounters with racism in society writ large, so that they don't have what the researchers call, these disorienting moments, right? Mm-hmm. These moments of shock when they walk out into the world and they are excluded or mistreated solely because of their race. So you want to prepare your child and give them the skills to navigate that. At the same time, you can't go too far, right? Because you don't want, to raise a Black child to believe that there are no allies. This is a society, that is, even as people of color, increase numerically, the power structure, right, is still with dominant America. So young Black children have to be able to navigate in that world and in that space. And so it's a really difficult line to walk. And so some of the research talks about just being careful, right? Saying, affirming the child. This is one of the things that I was fascinated by in the research. And I think we know that, but the value of Black studies, the value of highlighting Black achievement, the value of positive affirmation for Black children is more important than ever when a Black child is about to enter a world that is faced with discrimination. So you prep them, but tell them, don't be discouraged, right? The other very delicate line is teaching a child to speak up and assert their rights in a safe and healthy and productive way without getting killed by the police because they talk back. That's very hard to do because adolescents are adolescents. They're impulsive, they're emotional, they're reactive, they're fairness fanatics. And so you've got to teach your child, look, when you see the police, I'm all for it, give them the talk, right? And then you say to the child, but I'm going to create safe ways. I'm going to create opportunities for you to speak, for you to be at the table, for you to give voice for change. And that might be, internships with legislative leaders or policymakers or, going to your school and developing some sort of campaign. So the police-free schools movement is largely led by the young people, right? The movement to get police out of schools. Many of the protesters in the Black Lives Matter movement and in the post-George, I don't even call it post, we're in the midst of the George Floyd world, have been young people. And so creating space and opportunity for them to engage in healthy activism, right? Without getting killed by the police.
That's amazing. No, it's so rich, so much to talk about. We're coming up on 15 minutes left. So I want to give the audience a time to respond. But, since I got you here, I'm going to ask some more darn questions myself before we're able, and have to turn it over. So, you talk about resiliency, you've mentioned hope. Tell us about the critical role that hope might play, because, you're thinking about if your child gets arrested, what do you literally do, right? So if my child is arrested, I do the following. Maybe you can help us understand that. But then how do you nurture a sense of realistic hope that is not bland optimism? Optimism is putting your finger in the air and figuring out which way the wind is blowing. Hope often exists against the evidence, suggesting that we will overcome. So what do you do if your kid is arrested, if the police get your child? And how do you approach it as a parent of color because I'm gonna recommend that they all get your book and read it, because it gives them a sense of what their legal rights are, what the social atmosphere is that prevails, and it gives them a handle on trying to contend with the varied forces that have tried to rob Black youth of their childhoods. And nothing sadder to me than to see young Black kids not be able to do what young white kids do, to enjoy that innocence and that popcorn and balloon and rides on the Ferris wheel and so on and so forth. So help us understand, A, the practical measures, but B, also, in the broader landscape of things, how we appeal to real hope and resilience.
Yeah. So, this question of rehabilitation and resilience, I explore that on a number of different levels, and you've actually sort of touched on some of them and teased some of them. Right. So maybe we're teasing some of that out. One of your questions was, well, what happened if your child gets arrested, right? And so part of, and I sort of didn't articulate this early, but part of the criminalization we've been talking about, criminalizing normal adolescent behaviors. Another part of the criminalization is the hyper surveillance and over policing of Black children. But then there's this third part of criminalization. That is when a child does make a mistake, all right, does end up in the criminal legal system, how do we as a society respond? Right. And you talk about rage. I am so, just infuriated when, Black children, Dylan Roof, people, Cameron Terrell. If you don't know these names, go look them up or read my book better. But the point, right, is that white children have done some very horrendous things, or have done some very adolescent things that resulted in some very horrendous outcomes. And we've always managed to figure out what to do. Right? We've always managed to figure out a rehabilitative response, right? A community-based rehabilitative response. And so when a Black child gets arrested, I talk about this as another way of dehumanizing and criminalizing Black youth. We have no grace. We have no tolerance. They go under the jail, right? They get transferred to adult court. So I think part of what I say to parents, right, is really showing up in full force with your community and saying in court, we will not stand for it, right? So if your uncle, your grandmama, your granddaddy, your neighbor, your teacher, anybody and everybody who will come to bear in that situation, so that the courts can see, the probation could see that your child has a community of support. Of course, I'm going to say, defense, counsel. And as a defense attorney, when you need me, it's too late. Right. But I have to talk about that because indigent defense, is critical. We've got to fund indigent defense. So you've got to have a good lawyer and, your village come to bear, and really being able to show that your child, giving that narrative that your child is just a child. And I hate that that's on the responsibility of parents, because it shouldn't be. It's on society to make those shifts. But that's more on the legal, practical end, insisting upon letting the court know that there are evidence-based, proven rehabilitative strategies to work with even the most violent youth. Okay. Yeah. And so this idea that we have to lock them up and throw them away is just not accurate. And then I think you're asking more culturally about this notion of resilience. And I really think for me, that goes back to that irrationally caring adult, right? That we have a lot of work to do structurally in our society to reform to reform policing, to reform culture, the cultural attitudes about Black youth, but we can't wait that long. Right. Mm-hmm. And so until we get there, we've got to do everything we can for our young people, for our Black youth, in the meantime. So that's irrationally caring adults. It also means investing. And this is what HOPE is about: meaningful investing in alternatives to traditional law enforcement. So that means having mental health services in schools and in the community for young Black folks. That means all the things that educational opportunity, economic, vocational opportunity, all of those things, smaller class size. So I sound like I'm far afield, but resilience is, scaffolding the child with all those basic necessities that white children get everywhere else, right? That's what resilience is all about. And it's also grace and tolerance while children go through their adolescent years and act a fool. Act a fool. Right.
And don't pay the consequences for it.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. So in the few minutes we have left, what do you want readers to, what are like the major 2 or 3 lessons, insights, provocative reflections and observations you want them to take with them as they consume your book?
Yeah. So I think it is learn. So that means, I said earlier, you don't know what you don't know. And I gave you a book, so now you know. And so I really mean that, not even in jest. My book is just an introduction to, Black adolescence. And so my position is you got to learn to treat children like children by getting to know children. So wherever you sit, whether it's, a community member, what can I do in my neighborhood? What can I can do in my community to make a difference? So it sounds really trite, but it's so true. Every single person can do one thing. So who is it that you're reaching out to, mentoring, supporting in some way or another? That's one. Number 2 is the other aspect of learning. All the learning leads to action. So if I'm going to learn about the trauma, okay, so we haven't even talked about this, but there's a whole chapter called Policing as Trauma. And it's not just about traditional policing, but all the ways that we as civilians police Black children, but it's traumatic. And so the thing is this, you got to know just how traumatic it is to be a Black child who, like Eric, is ripped out of his classroom in front of his classmates and shuttled into the court system in ways that are exceedingly embarrassing. You have to understand the fear, anxiety, hopelessness, and depression that Black children experience. And once you know that, then you have an obligation to advocate, even as just a citizen, right? A resident of your community, to advocate and lobby in front of your local legislative body about the reforms that I talk about in the book. Okay, whether it be reducing the footprint of police in the lives of Black children, whatever role you can play in that legislative advocacy. So for me, it's learning and taking action and committing yourself to check your own biases, your own fears, and to treat Black children like children. That's the takeaway. That's how I end the book.
Yeah, it's powerful. It's powerful. One more question, when you think about the hurt, the pain, the trauma, and the devastation that our Black youth, adolescents confront with this, how do we protect them? I mean, is there a way to protect them? Is there a way to shield them? Martin Luther King Jr. talked about how, you got to tell your kids they can't go to Fun Town because it's segregated, right? Back in the day. And he says, you can see the clouds of inferiority forming in their mental sky.
Yeah.
How do we protect them against that?
Yeah. And what I read about in that and talk about in that Black adolescent identity chapter, it is building a strong, courageous, affirmed Black child, right? And so what the research talks about is that our knowledge of Black history and Black achievement serves as a buffer
Right.
to the discrimination that they're going to face. And so that we have a job to expose them at every single opportunity to Black greatness and to Black excellence, right? So that they have that vision and they have that opportunity. And so that's one way of supporting them. The other thing is, and I say this, you know, talking to teachers, counselors, and parents too, but creating space for honest conversation. How often do we go and we ask, and particularly, you know, my clients, right? I work with indigent clients. So these are clients in, you know, poor urban communities. How often do we create space for them to just sit down and talk about what they're afraid of? What worries them most, how they feel about getting up and going outside and running into the police. There have been wellness studies and qualitative studies where young people have talked about that they'd rather just stay inside than to go out into their neighborhood and risk being harassed by the police. There's evidence showing that children, Black children, sometimes withdraw from school, stop going to school. Why? Because they don't want this notion of inferiority, right? That feeling of inferiority, or going into a convenience store and watching everybody pull away, hide their purses. You know, there's one study, it's just out of Washington, DC, just in 2020, just last year, demonstrating that Black children face 5 racially discriminatory experiences per day, along the lines of what we're talking about. So we do have to prepare them for them, but make it clear that Black children aren't limited by those discriminatory encounters. So.
No doubt. Well, that's so powerful. We could go on and on and on. This incredible book about how Black youth, Black childhood is criminalized, you know, from rage and innocence. And those two things are not bipolar oppositions, but often go hand in hand, because your rage against the machinery of injustice then cause you to try to underscore the resilience and hopefulness that we can generate in order to fight these confounding issues that continue to undercut our ability as American citizens to live fully beyond the racist and white supremacist logics that continue to distort our perception of young Black people, of Black adolescents. And when we think about some of the horrors, as you've narrated in your book, I just recommend people go get it. It's distressing on the one hand, but it's eye-opening, and we need to know better in order to do better. And I think that your book does that in such a powerful and fascinating fashion.
Thank you so much, Michael. And I got to say to you, I so appreciate your last comment about rage. So many people ask me, well, what does the title mean? You nailed it, right? You know, you nailed it. The rage of innocence, I say, you know, globally is the rage that every single one of us should have when any one child is deprived of their, you know, God-given right to the presumption of innocence. But it is also on that more nuanced level, exactly what you said. It is that rage that Black children have after being told day after day that they are bad and that they are criminal. And Black children, like all of Black America, we stand up, right? And we resist those labels. And so that's what this rage is about. Black folks, you know, young folks speaking out the best way they know how. Right? It may not sound as articulate and intelligent and organized and calm and respectful as we might express our discontentment with American, you know, racist structures and American policing, but they do the best they can. And so I really appreciate your understanding of that title.
No, I appreciate it. I appreciate the title, appreciate the substance, I appreciate the explications. I'm so sorry. There's so much more we could have gotten into. I recommend that you all go out and get this book. It's an extremely powerful tool of inspiration and information, but most especially helping us navigate the treacherous waters of racism and white supremacy in America, and the ways in which we disabuse ourselves of the very fictions that have clotted the bloodstream of American race in this country. So thank you so very much. I'll call Brother Jeff to come back on. We'll give a virtual hand clap to Professor Henning for the extraordinary work that's going on here as well. So thank you so very kindly. And let's turn it back over to Brother Jeff.
And thank you again, Michael.
Thank you.
Have we lost Jeff? Oh, there he is.
Good night, everybody. No,
Hi.
I'm just going to step in and thank you everyone for coming tonight, and we will see you again very soon. Thank you to Professor Henning, Professor Dyson. We've got more virtual events coming up, some in-person events coming up in the next few weeks. And so thank you all. Keep reading, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
All right.
Thank you
Take
so
care,
very much.
everybody. Thank
Take
you
care.
again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.